Hello and welcome to the Last Mixtape Podcast. My name is Stephen White, and on this week's show, we trace how the Manic Street Preachers went from generation terrorists to critical thinkers. But first, everything in life is writable about if you have the outgoing guts to do it and the imagination to improvise. The words of Sylvia Plath. Why, Stephen, I hear you ask, dear listener, and indeed, dear viewer, are you quoting legendary poet Sylvia Plath at the start of this week's podcast? Well, this week I thought we'd delve into the career and timeline and work of the Manic Street Preachers in the build-up to the release of their new album, Critical Thinking. As always, full disclosure, this is a vibes podcast indeed. So we'll just be delving into the critical and cultural theory of the Manic Street Preachers themselves. So I don't know any dates and things like that and who had what for breakfast when they made what record. I don't know. I don't care. So it's kind of how we do things here. We kind of like to delve into things about how music resonates with you, resonates with me, and what we love about it. The Manic Street Preachers' career is a sprawling one and a very interesting one indeed. And obviously, as I say, with the upcoming release of Critical Thinking, is very interesting. However, it should be said at the very start of this podcast that this podcast will deal with elements of EDS and mental health. And indeed, the story of the Manic Street Preachers cannot be told without the story of Richey Edwards. So a warning to anyone who may be dealing with those issues or anything like that. In 1992, Manic Street Preachers burst onto the scene like a Molotov cocktail, rejecting mediocrity and promising to leave the world in flames before burning themselves out. Indeed, the explosive nature of the Manic Street Preachers is what drew so many people into them in those early days. Starting out in 1991 with tracks like Motown Junk and the chorus being, you know, I laughed when Lennon got shot. And they're kind of the promise of the band, the Manic Street Preachers, to go out in a blaze of glory, you know, release an album, sell 16 million records and just quit. And this was just absolutely, I think, as I say, like it was explosive. It was like a Molotov cocktail, the art situationist kind of philosophy of the band, which was really led by Richey Edwards and Nicky Wire, and the rest of the band, obviously James Dean Bradfield and Sean Moore. The band were kind of explosive. They were cultural. They leaned on the things that bands that were supposed to be indie and cool would not do, in terms of they were kind of stylistic, they were glam, something that at that time in the early 90s was incredibly passé. We're on the cusp of the grunge big bang, if you want to call it, in terms of music. So the Manic Street Preachers, when they began, and as they built up to the release of Generation Terrorists, were these kind of bratty art house Welsh band coming from, I believe it was Blackwood in Wales, and there was something other about them in terms of the music scene, you know, even from like, you know, the bands like from the Manchester scene, you know, the Happy Mondays and stuff like that would have been going New Order and things like that in English indie. And, you know, obviously the Manchester scene was itself about to explode with Britpop, with Oasis and the Stone Roses and bands like that. But the Manics always seemed quite other, and that early incendiary feel that they had in the build-up to Generation Terrorists, which is the kind of the cornerstone, is the beginnings, if you want to call it that, of their recording career, with You Love Us, Motorcycle Emptiness, Slash and Burn. The band was really something that seemed like it was about to, you know, it was something that was kind of like to burn out and fade away, to steal a line from Neil Young. And I think for me, that was always something that I found incredibly like a moth to a flame for me. And I think that's why so many people did, and especially to Richey Edwards, were kind of drawn to him. Now, obviously, many of the Manic Street Preachers fans probably watching this will know that there is questions as to what musically Richey could do. But in terms of the kind of the art direction and the lyrical direction and the home and the heart and the feel of the band, he was very much the auteur behind it. And the rest of the band as well are obviously collaborative in that nature. And, you know, James Dean Bradfield having to fit incredibly wordy lyrics into melodies and into music, and the band themselves being so incendiary. And obviously Nicky Wire was writing as well. But the build-up and the formation of the band, and they're kind of like, we're just here to sell 16 million and go. It does have that Cash from Chaos punk feel about it that was reminiscent of the Sex Pistols and things like that. And it was for them kind of that cultural explosion. And I think for me, that is what is so interesting of their journey, is that it begins in this feral rock nature. Generation Terrorist, the album, is beautiful in its... for me, I always liked albums with deep flaws, and it's this double album. There's so much of it. As I say, in times quite wordy, and the decision to have kind of programmed drums on it, which is interesting when you watch the kind of documentaries about the making of the album now. As the band look back, you can kind of see that Sean Moore wasn't entirely behind the idea or liked it, but like, you know, having to work in that ethos. And I think that album is kind of like a beautiful in its ragged glory. And it's not nowhere near perfect. It's nowhere near their best album. It's nowhere near their best work. But as a cultural cornerstone for what was going on, I think it's an incredible, incredible record. Motorcycle Emptiness is one of my favorite songs of all time. I think it's so beautiful, and it is the album at its best. Little Baby Nothing, I think as well, really works. Slash and Burn, as I say, You Love Us is that kind of incendiary call to arms type feel to it. And the band did feel and do feel quite as if they were something else happening over there. And I think, you know, and it would be interesting to hear from, you know, fans like watching in Wales. I do think it could only come from a Welsh band. And I think as we walk into this, you know, we go into this in terms of the Britpop stuff. I think they always felt slightly othered to that because of their kind of situationist philosophy, because of the deep philosophy behind the band and the kind of the art house feel to it. Generation Terrorists did not sell 16 million copies. They did not break up. And it's that brilliant kind of, a lot of bands have to do the kind of the backpedaling of, you know, the great one is the Who, I Hope I Die Before I Get Old, kind of feeling of, maybe not, you know, kind of feel. But it does kind of work for them in that way. They go again then 2 years later and release Gold Against the Soul, which I quite liked bits of. I don't think it's a kind of, given its flowers, interestingly enough. I think From Despair to Where and La Tristeza de Herrera, I think are quite beautiful songs. And I think they do, in their way and in this period, really lend themselves to something that I don't want to call it like why people connect to Richey Edwards, the songwriter, why they connect to him as the musician, why they connect to him as the person. Those songs in particular, you know, I poisoned every room in the house, which is the lyric from From Despair to Where, and even La Tristeza de Herrera, Scream to a Sigh. They do hint towards the issues at which Richey Edwards would have later on in his career. I should say at this point, we will slightly be touching on issues to do with ED and S and mental health. So from this point on, just be aware of that, because it is intrinsically linked into the story of the Manic Street Preachers. And I also want to give a shout out to Trash Theory. They did an incredible video on the Manic Street Preachers this year and Richey Edwards. So do check that out. I will put it in the link in the description. But yeah, we are going into an area now which will definitely touch on those themes, because it is a part of the Manic Street Preachers story, and it is part of Richey Edwards' story, unfortunately. So Gold Against the Soul is an album, I think, I think it's you know, Flowers in Hospital and stuff like that. It is this kind of beautiful album. It is them, I think, paring back a lot of what Generation Terrorist was, that ragged glory. So I think some of that kind of feral cultural nature of it is lost in the band trying to be a little bit more, I don't want to say a little bit more indie, but kind of moving into those areas and moving into kind of sounds that are not them looking to be, you know, at times Guns N' Roses, and at times kind of, you know, glam rock, and at times The Clash and stuff like that, and also looking for hits, because that's what they wanted for the 16 million recording. Again, it was much like Generation Terrorist, and I think much like most great work should be, it wasn't met entirely lovingly by critics, and I think is now maybe in terms of their albums maybe seen as a bridging gap to what becomes next and what comes next for the band. And what comes next is 1994's Holy Bible. And for a lot of people, this album is the Manic Street Preachers. Maybe for some it's where it begins and ends, or where their love of it, maybe they don't follow into the next era. But for many, this is their greatest work, and it's easy to see why. And it is a harrowing, hard listen of an album, I always felt. Even if, some of those songs do exist on best ofs, Faster is the obvious one. But it is an incredibly, incredibly hard listen at times. She is suffering, as well as is one of the tracks as well that is so harrowing in its nature. But obviously, Stone and 7 Pounds, which very directly goes into the idea of anorexia nervosa, of which Richey Edwards was suffering from at the time. The album, even in its cover art, delves into this, the kind of self-description, lack of self-worth, lack of sense of self, and the deep mental health issues of which Richey Edwards was having at the time. It should also be said, around about in between this time, the kind of the mythology around Richey Edwards and the band had also grown exponentially. Richey Edwards, prior to all of this, I think it was around 1991, in an interview at the NME, Richey Edwards, when being interviewed, and the band were kind of accused of not being real and not being what they said they were, and kind of being chancers, if you will. He carved into his arm for real with a razor blade. Such was his feeling towards those kind of accusations. As the band went on, and as you kind of look at the lyrical element of the band, and as I say, whether the musical input of Richey, and it should be said, Nicky Wire and James Ian Bradfield and Sean Moore obviously had so much to put into the music as well, but Richey was, for many, the kind of the front person, if you want, of the band when it came to the kind of the cultural aspects of it. Doing things like that, the issues that he had do come to the fore at Holy Bible. It is, as I say, a very hard, a 4 Stone 7 Pound is a very difficult listen. Faster, you can see why it's in the best ofs, but itself does have that undercurrent to it. She is suffering, also has that kind of deep undercurrent to it, as well as Revol. And so, yeah, it is a very difficult listen. It is, for many, the foundations of and the cornerstone of the Manic Street Preachers, and the zenith of their work, of their creative output. In terms of artistic pieces of work, it is monumental. It is not an album to be taken lightly. It is not an album that would go on in the background. I've always likened it to something like a documentary like The Act of Killing, which is this incredibly harrowing documentary that may be something that you would listen to once or watch once and listen to it at certain times if you're in that feeling of it. Because as it is a harrowing listen. It is an incredible piece of work. I know I believe in nothing, but it is my nothing. Richey Edwards. On February 1st, 1995, Richey Edwards disappeared. His abandoned car was found near the Severn Bridge, but no trace of him was ever discovered. For fans, Richey wasn't just a member of the band, he was their voice, their symbol of defiance. His disappearance left a void that was both personal and cultural. How could the band carry on without him? And for the fans, how could they reconcile their grief with the music they loved? Indeed, with Richey Edwards' disappearance, the band did think about breaking up, and obviously something like that would have an immense effect on anyone. You always have to remember that artists are people, bands are people, and the loss of a friend, the disappearance of a friend, and the not knowing what happened. And we're not here to kind of try guess upon what happened with Richey Edwards, but the band themselves were in limbo. Through that, they did decide to continue on, and for me, make what I believe is their best album, And Everything Must Go, which is a huge change from the stark nature of Holy Bible and into more anthemic music. It should also be said, at this very same time, Britpop had really come into its thing. Oasis had themselves taken over indie music in the UK and indeed in America to some degree. And so Britpop was in full flow, and it was kind of at the very right time for the Manics to come in and be anthemic. And the album is sprawling. There's the use of orchestration. The fact that Richey Edwards as well is still paid tribute to in terms of his lyrics are still used in the album beautifully in Kevin Carter, which is one of my favourite Manic Street Preachers songs, Small Black Flowers That Grow in the Sky as well. Elvis impersonator as well in Blackpool Pier. But for me, this is, as I say, the Manic's best work. One of the reasons why I love Motorcycle Emptiness is the production in it, the sound of it, and it really feels like, well, not as you know, Motorcycle Emptiness has its feral kind of nature to it. It almost sounds like a Slash. I believe Richie or James Dean Bradfield was asked to kind of play like Slash in that one. But on this is really a big turn into anthemic rock nature, and it was a massive success, most notably for the inclusion of a Design for Life, which if Motorcycle Emptiness is my favourite Manic song, with Australia as well, which is on this album, and Kevin Carter. A Design for Life could be seen as their best singular work within a song, because it is so iconic in its nature. But it also, and what we were talking about a bit earlier, is why the Manics always felt slightly apart from and aside to what was happening in Britpop at the time. It still kept that revolutionary nature that they had, that kind of working class roots that the band had, the kind of the philosophy that was ingrained to them. And I think, again, you know, for anyone watching who's from Wales and or anyone in that nature, I think that is inherently built from the working class Welsh nature of it. As an Irish person, it's something that you can kind of connect with, and you can kind of feel that kind of social and socialist nature to it. And A Design for Life is a sprawling piece of work. And to me, they're like, you know, libraries gave us power, but work came and set us free. What matters now? You know, it's just so brilliantly written. It is James Dean Bradfield at his best vocally as well. Even in songs that, as I say, Richey Edwards, sometimes there was an issue, and I think James says it in an interview where he was trying to fit lyrics into kind of melodies and stuff, even from Nicky Wire and stuff. In these, there's a bit more freedom for that as well, and the band really did kind of, if subvert, I suppose, in a way, the expectations of Holy Bible. Hard to follow something like that up, especially as thematic as it was and as mood driven as it was, and to follow it up with something that was so grandiose and so anthemic. And maybe if you look at them at the very beginning of their career, it would be kind of antithetical to where they were going. You can see the footprints of Everything Must Go in Gold Against the Soul. You can see bits of it, I think, too, in Holy Bible. Maybe not as much in Generation Terrorists, but it's there. Those sounds are there. And Everything Must Go, with all of it, Australia, Kevin Carter, A Design for Life, Everything Must Go, this track itself is just so monumental. And again, you know, it's one of those albums where you could feel like it makes sense now looking back on it, but it was quite different. And I think that's what led people to be so engrossed in it. And I think maybe for fans of what had come before, the fact that Richie's lyrics were used in the album too, is what made it feel so natural and such a positive thing that the band had kept going, that they were not going for just in it for the money. They were continuing the artistic feel that had gone straight through it. Follow that up with This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours, which again was a massive success for the band, as had been Everything Must Go. It was kind of a 1-2 punch in terms of albums. It was a bit more subdued, I think, with a more of a focus on personal and political themes, especially, you know, with If You Tolerate This, Then Your Children Will Be Next, which is probably the massive anthem from it. Although The Everlasting and Tsunami are also, Black Dog, are also great tracks from it. But If You Tolerate This, Then Your Children Will Be Next is probably the song that is most associated with it. It's interesting, I remember watching an interview with Nicky Wire where I think he was quite complimentary of the album, but I think he described it as we were in our less slutty era then. If you look at them, they're very well, you know, put together, and they're very kind of, you know, it's not as lipstick laden and leopard print laden as maybe their earlier work was. But I think as an album, it works. I think If You Tolerate This, Then Your Children Will Be Next is, again, it's a close one, and you can see it's almost, and I don't think it's them trying to do it, but you can feel it's a little bit of a design for life. It's the design for life of that record, and it works so brilliantly. If I can't shoot rabbits, then I can't shoot fascists, which is such a great line and so needed now. As well, that line of, if I can shoot fascists, if I can shoot rabbits, then I can shoot fascists. For my occasional people who like to chime in the comments with their, hi. So yeah, again, calling back to those roots and that kind of the socialist Welsh nature of it, which I absolutely love. And it was huge. It was such a massive album. It did, I think, for some people, it maybe lack the fire of A Generation Terrorist or even the thematic fire of a Holy Bible. But it is certainly one of their great pieces of work. Following that then, of course, with Know Your Enemy and Lifeblood. Know Your Enemy I quite liked. So I So Sad, I thought it was a really cool track and found that soul as well. Even Ocean Spray and Let Robinson Sing. But this would become, that and Lifeblood would become what would be commercially and critically a kind of a lull for the band. The late 90s and 2000s were a roller coaster for the Manics. They achieved massive success with This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours, which topped the charts and produced their first #1 single. But experimentation came with risks. Albums like Know Your Enemy and Lifeblood divided fans, leaving the band at a crossroads. So indeed, at this point in their career, the Manics kind of felt a little bit like they were lacking in their identity, lacking in who the band was, and the need to kind of rekindle that fire and rekindle that essence that had gone through all the rest of their records, up to, I suppose, Lifeblood. I really didn't like Lifeblood as an album, but it was them kind of kicking back. They needed to kick back, and with Send Away the Tigers, they did so. They rekindled themselves as a band with kind of that kind of energy had come back to it. And in the mid-2000s, it really felt like the Manics had returned and into a new era, if you will, yet again, of the band. Your Love Alone, which featured Anna Pearson on it, was a big radio hit. And it had that, again, it had that fire to it too. It had that kind of incendiary nature to it. Autumn Song. I really like Indian Summer from that record as well. And it did feel like the Manics... after the lull, that especially that was Lifeblood, coming back into a little bit of that anthemic sound of it, and also kind of holding true to kind of the nature of the band and the struggle with inner demons and the collective resilience that had always been kind of the buoy that had kind of pushed the band's sound. And I think for me as well, that was kind of, they lost me at Lifeblood. I did like, as I said, I liked Know Your Enemy enough, but this was kind of the beginning and the rekindling of that fire. That would be quickly followed by Journal for Plague Lovers, which itself was an album using raw lyrics of Richey Edwards before his disappearance. It is incredibly minimalist and dark, but again, that idea of them rekindling the essence of who they are, kind of going back to Richey in this way and honouring his memory. And obviously you feel that Richey was something that was always kind of in the background for the band, that kind of, that, dare I say, a trauma that existed within the band's history. Going back for Journal for Plague Lovers, I think in this era of the band, of the Manics, I think this is their best album. If Holy Bible is the best album, Richey Edwards, post Richey Edwards, Everything Must Go, and then this new era, I think Journal for Plague Lovers is probably one of their best albums. And I think, it's stark nature, it's minimalist nature, Jackie Collins' existential question, which again is going back to that Jackie Collins' existential question, and the wordy nature of his lyrics, which is something that I think set him apart and set the band apart at those early days. You do feel for Dean Bradfield having to kind of fit all these things in, and peeled apples and stuff like that. It is such a bold thing to do for the band, because it could be seen as them going back to a well, it could have been seen as a regression from the band, but it wasn't. It was them honouring the memory and again rekindling the essence that went through the entirety of them. And it was a bad way for many fans that maybe lost in the interim years to kind of rekindle their love as well for the band. And I think this era of the band finding themselves and finding that, that energy especially in Journal for Plague Lovers, is there, and it's one of my favorite albums from that era. I think as well followed by a 1-2 punch in a way of Postcards from a Young Man, which I really liked. I really liked a lot of the album. It's not war. It's not war. Just the End of Love, I think, is a great track from that as well. And I think those kind of follow up records, I think, kind of find a band that are incredibly mature and find a love for kind of reinventing themselves. Futurology, the next record as well, would do so too. And rewind the film Futurology as well. I think it's the band comfortable in themselves, comfortable in that essence, comfortable in their writing, and being a band that always had something artistic or mood driven to say. And I don't think they ever went back into that lull that would be the post This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours era, those two albums if you want, although I do believe it's this consistency of great work. Nowhere near, I think, Holy Bible or even Everything Must Go, but certainly a band that held true to what it was that they were, where they were at the beginning of their career, not becoming or trying to be a parody of that or trying to totally recapture that, but still becoming something of the Manics, the Manic Street Preachers, holding true to that name and honouring that name and honouring their own legacy. Now, in 2025, the Manics return with Critical Thinking. From the first 3 singles and their social media output, you can see that this album is a conversation between the past and the present, a reminder that evolution doesn't erase history, but builds on it. The Manic Street Preachers began as rebellious dreamers. Decades later, they've become survivors, proving that rebellion doesn't have to burn out, it can endure. And that, perhaps, is their greatest legacy. And so it goes, and there it went. The Manic Street Preachers will be releasing their brand new album, Critical Thinking, at the end of this month. It'll be their 15th studio album. And releases like Fragments of Doubt and The Last Idealist does look like the band looking back at their own journey and asking themselves some very difficult questions about that journey and how they reconnect and connect with their audience. It is a very interesting album in that way, and it's why I wanted to discuss the journey of the Manic Street Preachers in as kind of the way I've just done. But I think they're such an interesting band for that, and I think this is such an interesting time. Even the title, Critical Thinking, seeing themselves the last idealist and stuff like that, and looking back, even their, like, as I say, their social media output of looking back on older records and looking back at their history of a band. Like, it's an incredible body of work. It's an incredible journey. It's one that is fraught with peril throughout, but one where somehow that rebellious nature, that essence that we spoke about, somehow they came out of it all with that, and seem to be coming out of all of that with that, acknowledging that weight of the past, acknowledging what has come before. It's that introspection, that kind of raw nature of the band that has always been one of the things that have always drawn them to me. I myself, listening as a young man to their lyrics, to Motorcycle Emptiness, to Holy Bible, and there was a period in time where that really spoke to me in a very deep way, in a very emotive way. That album and those types of things that they did, it's easy to see why people connect with them so deeply and so hard. I'm sure there's people watching this have even more stories, even more relevance to them. Some of their records have and resonate in a deep way, and hopefully when we all listen to Critical Thinking, it will feel that way as well. And I think the signs are very much there that they will. But that is the career of the Manic Street Preachers. It is an incredible one. It is an incredible journey, and it's not over. Obviously, the release of the new album will be coming out. But what are your thoughts? What is your favorite Manic Street Preachers song, album, era? What resonates with you most about it? What do you think of the new album when it comes out? What are you excited to hear about them? What are your stories about the Manic Street Preachers? What is it that you love about them? Why do they resonate with you? Do you feel that essence of the band has stuck with them the whole way, as I do? And so it goes, and there it went. But before I go, thank you for watching and listening to the Last Mixtape Podcast here on YouTube, Apple, and indeed on Spotify. If you could like, comment, and subscribe to the podcast and help it grow, I would be eternally grateful. If you want to send on new music to Last Mixtape Podcast, I promise the Count of Monty playlist will be back next week. He is deep in the delves of Irish music, picking out all sorts of new tracks for a new monthly playlist that he will be coming on for. But for now, that was Last Mixtape Podcast. I was Stephen White. You're the listener and the viewer. Hey, so long.